$400 million. In today's money, that figure approaches $10 billion. This was the fortune that Caroline Schermerhorn Astor commanded from her throne on Fifth Avenue. A woman so powerful that she single-handedly decided who mattered in American society. Her guest list of 400 names became the definitive measure of social worth. If Caroline Astor did not know your name, you simply did not exist. Her husband, William Backhouse Astor Jr., controlled more real estate than any private citizen in American history. Block after block of Manhattan belonged to the family. Entire neighborhoods paid rent to the Astor name. The family had been accumulating property since the 1700s. By the time the 20th century dawned, they owned a significant portion of the most valuable island on Earth. Their children were raised in marble palaces. Their grandchildren attended the finest schools in Europe. Their great-grandchildren were expected to carry the dynasty forward for another century. Instead, they destroyed everything. Within 3 generations, the Astor fortune would scatter like autumn leaves. Mansions would be demolished. Properties would be sold. Family members would die in scandal, poverty, and obscurity. The name that once commanded instant respect would become a cautionary tale whispered in the drawing rooms of newer money. This is not a story of bad luck. This is not a story of market forces beyond anyone's control. This is the story of choices. Terrible, selfish, short-sighted choices made by people who believed their wealth made them untouchable. Today, on Old Money documentaries, we trace the complete arc of the Astor dynasty. From the immigrant fur trader who arrived with nothing to the final heirs who squandered everything. From the ballrooms of the Gilded Age to the bankruptcy courts of the modern era, this is the story of how America's first family lost it all. To understand how the Astor fortune was lost, we must first understand how it was built. And that story begins not in a Manhattan mansion but in a small village in Germany. Johann Jacob Astor was born on the 17th of July 1763 in Waldorf, a town in the German state of Baden. His father was a butcher. His mother died when he was young. There was no wealth in the Astor household. There was no connection to power. There was only work. And the young Johann Jacob learned early that survival required relentless effort. At 17, he left Germany forever. He would never return. His first destination was London, where his brother George had established a small business making musical instruments. Johann worked there for several years, learning English and saving every penny he earned. He was not content to build flutes for wealthy customers. He wanted to become wealthy himself. In 1784, at the age of 20, he boarded a ship bound for the newly independent United States of America. The journey took months. He arrived in Baltimore with almost nothing. Some accounts suggest he possessed only a few dollars and a handful of flutes to sell. Other accounts claim he had even less. What he did possess was ambition that burned like fire. He made his way to New York City, a muddy port town of 30,000 souls. The streets were unpaved. Pigs roamed freely. The aristocracy of the old world would have dismissed it as a backwater. Johann Jacob Astor saw something else entirely. He saw opportunity. His first job was sweeping floors for a fur trader. He watched carefully. He learned which pelts commanded the highest prices. He studied the relationships between trappers, traders, and European buyers. Within 2 years, he had saved enough to start his own fur trading operation. The timing was perfect. American expansion was pushing westward. Native American trappers were harvesting beaver, otter, and fox in quantities that European markets craved. Johann Jacob Astor positioned himself as the middleman between wilderness and wealth. He was ruthless. He extended credit to trappers who could not repay, then seized their entire harvest. He undercut competitors and drove them out of business. He cultivated relationships with government officials who could grant him exclusive trading rights. By 1800, he had established the American Fur Company as the dominant force in the North American fur trade. But Astor understood something that separated him from other merchants of his era. Fur trading was lucrative, but furs were a commodity. Prices fluctuated. Fashions changed. Competitors emerged. He needed something more permanent. He chose land. Manhattan Island in the early 1800s was a study in contrasts. The southern tip was densely developed, crowded with merchants and sailors and craftsmen. The northern portions remained farmland, considered too remote from the commercial center to hold significant value. Astor disagreed. He began purchasing property north of the developed areas, farm after farm, plot after plot. His contemporaries thought him foolish. Why buy empty land miles from where business happened? Astor simply smiled and kept buying. His vision was clear. New York was growing. Population was increasing. Commerce was expanding. Eventually, the city would extend northward, and every acre he purchased for a pittance would become worth a fortune. He was spectacularly correct. By the time of his death in 1848, John Jacob Astor, as he now styled himself, had accumulated approximately $20 million. Adjusted for inflation, this sum exceeds $500 million in today's currency. Some estimates place his wealth even higher. He was, by any measure, the richest man in America. His real estate holdings were staggering. He owned entire blocks of Manhattan. He collected rent from thousands of tenants. His property portfolio generated income that grew automatically as the city expanded around his holdings. But Astor's genius extended beyond mere accumulation. He structured his estate to preserve wealth across generations. He established trusts. He created legal mechanisms to prevent any single heir from liquidating family property. He understood that fortunes could be lost as easily as they were gained. On his deathbed, he reportedly expressed only one regret. He wished he had bought more land. His son, William Backhouse Astor, inherited the responsibility of managing this empire. William was not his father's equal in vision or drive, but he possessed a crucial quality: caution. He continued purchasing property. He avoided speculation. He lived modestly compared to his means. Under his stewardship, the Astor fortune doubled again. William's son, John Jacob Astor III, followed the same conservative path. The family wealth continued growing. By the 1872, the Astors owned so much of Manhattan that their annual rent collections exceeded the budget of several American states. 3 generations of careful management. 3 generations of modest living and prudent investment. The foundation seemed unshakable. Then came the 4th generation, and everything changed. Caroline Webster Schermerhorn was not born an Astor. She married into the family in 1853, wedding William Backhouse Astor Jr., grandson of the original John Jacob. It was a union of 2 prominent New York families, the Schermerhorns having made their fortune in shipping and chandlery. Caroline brought something to the marriage that money alone could not purchase. She brought lineage. The Schermerhorns had been in New York since the 1600s. They were Dutch Reformed aristocracy, part of the Knickerbocker elite who considered themselves the true founders of New York society. The Astors, by contrast, were newcomers. Yes, they had money. Enormous amounts of money. But the original John Jacob had been a butcher's son who spoke with a German accent until his dying day. In the rigid social hierarchy of 19th-century New York, such origins mattered. Caroline set out to change this. She would transform the Astor name from a commercial brand into a social institution. She would make her family not merely rich, but respectable. She would become, in the process, the most powerful woman in America. Her campaign began with the construction of a palace. The Astor residence at 350 Fifth Avenue rose like a temple to ambition. Its brownstone facade concealed interiors of breathtaking opulence, art imported from European masters, furniture crafted by the finest artisans, a ballroom designed to hold exactly 400 guests. That number was not arbitrary. Caroline Astor had determined that precisely 400 people constituted acceptable society in New York. Not 401, not 399, 400. The criterion for inclusion was mysterious, subjective, and entirely controlled by Caroline herself. Wealth alone was insufficient. The newly rich were excluded regardless of their bank balances. Family heritage mattered, but exceptions were made for those who displayed sufficient refinement. The ultimate test was whether Caroline Astor chose to recognize you. Her annual ball became the defining event of the New York social calendar. An invitation was validation. Exclusion was social death. Newspapers devoted pages to describing who attended, and what they wore. The guest list was studied, analyzed, and debated. Caroline presided over these events like a monarch holding court. She positioned herself before a life-sized portrait of herself, receiving guests who approached as supplicants approach a throne. Diamonds dripped from her neck and wrists. Her manner conveyed absolute authority. The Mrs. Astor, as she became known, wielded power that presidents might have envied. She could elevate a family to social prominence with a single invitation. She could destroy reputations with a pointed exclusion. Her opinions on matters of taste and propriety became law. But this power came at a cost. Maintaining social supremacy required constant expenditure. The balls grew more elaborate. The jewels grew more expensive. The competition for prominence intensified as other wealthy families attempted to challenge Astor dominance. Caroline's children were raised in this hothouse of privilege and pressure. They learned that appearances mattered above all else. They learned that money existed to be displayed. They learned that their social position required perpetual defense against newcomers and climbers. They did not learn how their fortune had been built. They did not understand the decades of careful property management that generated their wealth. They knew only that money appeared when needed, as if by magic. This ignorance would prove catastrophic. William Backhouse Astor Jr., Caroline's husband, retreated from his wife's social campaigns. He spent increasing amounts of time aboard his yacht, sailing to distant waters while Caroline conquered New York drawing rooms. Their marriage, whatever its origins, had become a business arrangement. William focused on managing the family real estate holdings. He continued the conservative approach of his father and grandfather. He collected rents. He maintained properties. He purchased additional land when opportunities arose. But he failed to prepare his children for the responsibilities of wealth. The boys were educated at fine schools but learned nothing of business. The girls were groomed for advantageous marriages but taught nothing of financial management. The assumption was that the money would always be there. Caroline and William produced 5 children who survived to adulthood. Emily, Helen, Charlotte, Caroline, and John Jacob IV. Each would play a role in the dynasty's decline. Each would contribute, in their own way, to the destruction of what had taken a century to build. The eldest surviving son, John Jacob Astor IV, was the designated heir. Upon him would fall the responsibility of carrying the family name into the 20th century. He possessed intelligence, education, and access to resources beyond imagining. He would die on the Titanic at the age of 47. His death would accelerate the family's unraveling in ways no one could have predicted. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before the iceberg, before the scandals, before the divorces and the lawsuits and the squandered fortunes, there was the moment when the Astor family stood at the absolute peak of American society and began their descent. By 1890, the Astor family had developed a problem that money could not solve. There were too many Mrs. Astors. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor had reigned as the Mrs. Astor for decades. Her authority over New York society was unquestioned. But time advances even for social monarchs. Caroline was aging. Her son William had married a woman who had ideas of her own. Mary Dahlgren Paul was known as Mamie to friends and family. She married William Waldorf Astor, the only son of John Jacob Astor III, in 1878. This marriage created a complicated situation. William Waldorf's father was the senior male in the Astor family. By European standards of precedence, this would make Mamie the senior Mrs. Astor. Caroline disagreed. She had built her social empire through decades of effort. She had no intention of surrendering her title to a younger woman, regardless of technicalities. The battle lines formed quickly. Both women claimed the designation Mrs. Astor on calling cards and invitations. Both expected to be recognized as the supreme arbiter of social matters. New York society watched with barely concealed delight as 2 branches of America's richest family prepared for war. William Waldorf Astor, Mamie's husband, was not content to let his wife fight alone. He was a proud man, perhaps excessively so, and he considered his Aunt Caroline's continued dominance an insult to his side of the family. His father, after all, was the eldest living male Astor. The title should follow bloodline, not ballroom accomplishment. The conflict escalated through subtle gestures and pointed snubs. When Caroline gave a ball, Mamie scheduled a competing event. When one Mrs. Astor appeared in diamonds, the other appeared in larger diamonds. The newspapers reported every exchange with gleeful attention to detail. William Waldorf eventually decided on a dramatic gesture. In 1890, he demolished his father's house at 33rd Street and 5th Avenue and began construction of a hotel on the site. The Waldorf Hotel would rise directly beside his Aunt Caroline's residence, its 13 stories looming over her brownstone palace. The message was unmistakable. William Waldorf was declaring that if he could not defeat his aunt socially, he would overwhelm her architecturally. Her intimate ballroom would exist in the shadow of his commercial enterprise. Caroline was outraged, but she recognized the tactical genius of the move. A hotel next door would bring noise, crowds, and the sort of people who stayed in hotels rather than residences. Her palace had been compromised. Her response was equally dramatic. She demolished her own home and constructed a new residence uptown at 65th Street and 5th Avenue. This new mansion would be larger, grander, and safely distant from her nephew's hotel. But she did not abandon the original property entirely. Her son, John Jacob Astor, built his own hotel on the site of her former residence. This became the Astoria Hotel. Eventually, the feuding branches of the family agreed to connect the two hotels, creating the legendary Waldorf Astoria. The construction required negotiation. The connecting corridor, known as Peacock Alley, included a mechanism that allowed either side to seal it off if relations soured again. The families had made peace, but they had also prepared for continued war. William Waldorf eventually gave up on America entirely. In 1891, he moved his family to England, declaring that his country had become unfit for gentlemen. He purchased Cliveden, one of the great English country estates, and Hever Castle, once the childhood home of Anne Boleyn. He would later renounce his American citizenship and accept a British title, becoming Viscount Astor. His departure removed one combatant from the social battlefield, but the damage to family unity was permanent. The Astors had divided into American and English branches. Property that had once been managed collectively now required coordination across an ocean. More importantly, the feud had revealed something troubling about the family's priorities. Both sides had been willing to spend lavishly on symbolic victories. Hotels and mansions and competing balls had consumed millions. The careful stewardship of the founding generations had given way to competitive display. Caroline continued her reign through the 1,890 seconds, but age was catching up with her. Her mental clarity began to fade. She would appear at balls believing herself to be a young woman, speaking to guests who had died decades earlier. Her family installed her in her new mansion and quietly reduced her public appearances. She died in 1908. Still, technically the Mrs. Astor, though her kingdom had already begun to crumble. Her obituaries praised her as a social pioneer, a woman who had given structure and meaning to the chaos of American wealth. They did not mention the feuds, the expenditures, the priorities that had begun redirecting family resources from investment to display. The next generation inherited her title but not her power. Society was changing. New fortunes from industry and finance were challenging old money's dominance. The carefully guarded gates of the 400 were being breached by people who had more money than the Astors and cared less about tradition. The world Caroline had built was ending. Her descendants would discover that social prominence without the wealth to sustain it was a precarious position indeed. John Jacob Astor IV should have been the man who saved the dynasty. He possessed every advantage his great-great-grandfather had lacked. Education at the finest schools, connections to the most powerful families, inherited wealth that freed him from any need to earn a living. He was born on the 13th of July, 1864, into a world where the name Astor opened every door. His childhood was spent between the Fifth Avenue mansion and the family's country estate at Rhinebeck. Private tutors prepared him for Harvard. He graduated in 1888 with a degree and a conviction that he was destined for great things. His ambitions extended beyond mere wealth management. He wanted to invent, to innovate, to leave his own mark on the world rather than simply inheriting his ancestors' achievements. He patented several devices, including a bicycle brake and a machine for extracting peat from bogs. None achieved commercial success. He wrote a science fiction novel, A Journey in Other Worlds, published in 1894. The book imagined humanity in the year 2000, traveling through space and encountering spirits on Saturn and Jupiter. Critics were polite but unimpressed. Astor's writing showed imagination but limited literary skill. These pursuits consumed time and money without generating returns. The real estate empire required attention that John Jacob IV was reluctant to provide. He preferred dreaming of the future to managing the present. His personal life proved equally complicated. In 1891, he married Ava Lowell Willing, a Philadelphia socialite of impeccable breeding. The wedding was a major social event, uniting two prominent families in what everyone assumed would be an enduring partnership. The marriage was miserable almost from the start. Ava was strong-willed, intelligent, and utterly incompatible with her husband. They disagreed on politics, parenting, and the fundamental purpose of their existence. John Jacob retreated into his inventions and his novels. Ava dominated their social calendar and raised their two children, Vincent and Ava, with minimal input from their father. By 1909, the pretense had become unsustainable. John Jacob filed for divorce, a scandal that shocked society, despite the open secret of their estrangement. Divorce was still deeply stigmatized among the upper classes. An Astor divorce was front-page news. The settlement was expensive. Ava received a substantial portion of the family assets and custody of their daughter. John Jacob kept most of his real estate holdings but emerged from the process diminished in both wealth and reputation. Then, less than 2 years later, he made everything worse. Madeline Talmadge Force was 18 years old when John Jacob Astor IV began courting her. He was 47. The age difference alone would have raised eyebrows, but the timing made it catastrophic. He had barely finalized his divorce when he began pursuing a girl younger than his own son. Society's reaction was swift and merciless. Former friends cut the couple dead. Ministers denounced the relationship from pulpits. Newspapers published editorials questioning Astor's judgment and character. The name that had once guaranteed entry anywhere now attracted whispered contempt. John Jacob seemed not to care. He married Madeline in September 1911, in a small ceremony in Newport. The guest list was notably short. Even families who had socialized with the Astors for decades declined to attend. The newlyweds fled America for an extended honeymoon in Europe and Egypt. They were escaping scrutiny, waiting for the scandal to fade. Madeline became pregnant during the trip, and by early 1912, she wanted to return home to give birth in America. They booked passage on the newest and most luxurious ocean liner afloat. The ship was called Titanic. The night of the 14th of April, 1912, was cold and clear. The Titanic was steaming at near maximum speed through waters known to contain icebergs. When the collision came, John Jacob Astor reportedly helped his young wife into lifeboat number 4. He asked if he might accompany her, given her condition. The officer refused. Women and children only. John Jacob Astor IV stepped back from the lifeboat and watched his pregnant wife lowered toward the dark water. He was never seen alive again. His body was recovered more than a week later, identified by the initials on his clothing. His personal effects included a gold watch and $2,500 in cash. He was buried in the family cemetery at Trinity Church in New York. Madeline survived. She gave birth to a son, John Jacob V, 4 months later. The child would never know his father. He would inherit a share of the Astor fortune, but none of his father's memories or guidance. The death of John Jacob IV removed the last adult male who understood how the family empire functioned. His son Vincent was only 20 years old. His other son was an infant. The estates, the properties, the complex web of trusts and holdings, all of it now fell to young men without experience or training. The dynasty had lost its captain at the worst possible moment. Vincent Astor inherited a fortune and a catastrophe simultaneously. He was 20 years old when his father died on the Titanic. He had not been trained for responsibility. He had not been taught how the family properties were managed. He knew only that he was now, suddenly, the head of the American Astor family. The scale of his inheritance was staggering. Real estate holdings across Manhattan, trust funds generating millions annually, art, furniture, jewels, and properties scattered across the country and Europe. The paper value exceeded $100 million, an amount that would approach $3 billion in today's currency. But the inheritance was not as liquid as those numbers suggested. Properties required management. Taxes consumed significant portions of income. The family's lifestyle demands remained constant even as the foundation supporting them became more complicated. Vincent had been raised in privilege without purpose. His father's attention had wandered toward inventions and young women. His mother had been consumed by society's demands. Neither had prepared him for the burden now falling on his shoulders. He made an immediate decision that would define his tenure as family patriarch. He would not continue the social pretensions of his grandmother, Caroline. He would not fight for position in ballrooms or compile guest lists of acceptable persons. He would live more modestly and manage more carefully. This represented a genuine break from Astor tradition. For decades, the family had poured money into displays of wealth that generated no return. Vincent recognized that such expenditures were unsustainable. The fortune was vast but not infinite. He sold many of the family's residential properties. The great mansions that had cost millions to build were demolished or converted to other uses. The era of private palaces on Fifth Avenue was ending, and Vincent accelerated its conclusion. He consolidated the remaining real estate holdings into more manageable portfolios. He hired professional managers to oversee properties that previous generations had supervised personally. He tried, essentially, to modernize a fortune that had been built on 19th-century assumptions. His personal life proved more turbulent than his business affairs. He married 3 times. His first wife, Helen Dinsmore Huntington, was a socially prominent woman who expected the Astor name to maintain its traditional position. When Vincent declined to play the role of society host, the marriage suffered. They divorced in 1940. After more than 2 decades of increasing distance, Helen received a substantial settlement. The family wealth was again divided by failed marriage. Vincent's second marriage was stranger still. He wed Mary Benedict Cushing, known as Minnie, who was simultaneously connected to several of New York's most prominent families through her sister's marriages. Minnie had been married before, to James Roosevelt, son of President Franklin Roosevelt. She brought connections to political power but also expectations of continued prominence. This marriage lasted until Vincent's death, but it was not without complications. Minnie was ambitious in ways that Vincent had rejected. She wanted the Astor name to mean something more than careful property management. She pushed for social engagement that Vincent found exhausting and pointless. More significantly, Vincent and Minnie had no children. This absence would prove critical when decisions about the family's future had to be made. There was no obvious heir. The fortune that had been built over a century had no young Astor waiting to receive it. Vincent's half-brother, John Jacob Astor, was technically in the line of inheritance, but Vincent had never been close to his father's son by the teenage bride. The Titanic had created not just a tragedy, but a division within the family that never healed. John Jacob Astor lived a life of privilege without accomplishment. He married twice, divorcing both times. He produced children but showed little interest in the responsibilities of wealth. Vincent watched his half-brother with a mixture of contempt and disappointment. When Vincent drew up his will, he made a decision that shocked the family and the public. He left the bulk of his fortune not to his half-brother or any Astor relative, but to a charitable foundation. The Vincent Astor Foundation would distribute his wealth to causes he cared about, rather than allowing it to pass to relatives he did not trust. This decision represented both the end of the Astor dynasty and a judgment on its surviving members. Vincent had concluded that his family was not worthy of the fortune it had inherited. He would rather give the money away than watch another generation squander it. The foundation operated for decades after Vincent's death in 1959, distributing hundreds of millions to New York institutions, the New York Public Library, the Metropolitan Museum, and countless other organizations benefited from Astor money that would never go to Astor heirs. Vincent's verdict on his own family was harsh but perhaps accurate. He had watched the trajectory of the Astor name for 47 years. He had seen the lawsuits and divorces. He had seen the properties sold and the lifestyle maintained on diminishing resources. He had concluded that the dynasty was finished. His will made that conclusion official. While the American Astors were declining, Their English cousins were building a different kind of power. William Waldorf Astor's decision to abandon the United States had seemed like retreat in 1891. By the early 20th century, it looked more like escape. He had purchased respectability in England with the same methods his grandfather had used in America. He bought property. He cultivated connections. He demonstrated that his money came with culture and taste rather than the crude ambition of the newly rich. Cliveden, his country estate on the Thames, became a center of political and social influence. Politicians and writers gathered there for weekend parties that shaped British policy. The Astor name in England meant not just wealth, but intellectual engagement and political consequence. William Waldorf received a barony in 1916, becoming Baron Astor of Hever Castle. He was elevated to Viscount in 1917. The butcher's great-great-grandson had become a British lord. His son Waldorf married Nancy Langhorne Shaw, an American divorcee from Virginia whose wit and energy made her one of the most famous women in England. Nancy Astor would become the first woman to sit in the British Parliament, taking her husband's seat in the House of Commons when he was elevated to the House of Lords. The English Astors seemed to have solved the problem that destroyed their American cousins. They had converted money into position. They had established a dynasty that produced not just heirs but achievers. Waldorf was a newspaper owner and political figure. Nancy was a parliamentarian. Their children entered public service, journalism, and business. But the English branch had its own complications. The Astors' political activities during the 1,930 seconds would damage their reputation permanently. Cliveden became associated with a group of politicians and intellectuals who favored accommodation with Nazi Germany. The Cliveden set, as newspapers called them, was accused of working toward appeasement when confrontation was necessary. Nancy Astor's comments about Jews and other groups revealed attitudes that would not survive public scrutiny in later decades. When World War II demonstrated the catastrophic failure of appeasement, the Cliveden Astors found their influence evaporating. They had bet on the wrong side of history. The political connections they had cultivated for decades became liabilities rather than assets. Nancy Astor retired from Parliament in 1945, largely pushed out by a party that no longer valued her presence. Waldorf died in 1952, having watched his life's work become tainted by association with policies that led to catastrophe. Their children inherited money and titles, but not the influence their parents had wielded. The English Astor story, which had seemed so successful compared to the American decline, turned out to have its own trajectory toward irrelevance. Cliveden was eventually given to the National Trust. Hever Castle became a tourist attraction. The properties remained, but the power had departed. The family that had divided in anger in the 1,890 seconds had found separate paths to the same destination. Whether in New York or London, the Astors had transformed from builders to inheritors, from creators to consumers. And consumers eventually run out of things to consume. The Astor family accumulated significant wealth over several generations. As this wealth passed from one generation to the next, it became divided among many heirs and managed through formal legal arrangements. After the death of John Jacob Astor IV, his estate was distributed according to a carefully designed will. The plan prioritized his children and limited access to the main assets for other beneficiaries. Income was provided through a trust, while the principal remained protected to ensure long-term continuity of the family holdings. Over time, changes in family circumstances affected how these arrangements functioned. Portions of the wealth were gradually reduced, redistributed, or managed in new ways as the years passed. In later decades, members of the family in both the United States and the United Kingdom became widely known through public records and media coverage. Attention shifted away from business activity and toward personal and social matters, which altered public perception of the family name. By the mid-20th century, several branches of the family no longer played a significant role in managing or expanding the original holdings. Some assets were transferred, while others were sold or placed into long-term financial structures. In the United States, the final direct heirs with ties to the original fortune did not maintain large-scale property ownership. Major real estate holdings that once formed the foundation of the family's wealth were gradually sold during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. As a result, the Astor family's financial influence diminished. The remaining wealth became dispersed across various investments, with little connection to the original enterprises that created it. Today, the Astor name remains visible mainly through established place names and institutions. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel continues to carry the family name under corporate ownership, and Astor Place in Manhattan marks an area associated with the family's early presence in the city. While the name endures, the family dynasty itself no longer exists in its original form. The Astor story raises a question that every wealthy family must eventually confront. How do you preserve a fortune across generations when the very wealth you want to preserve removes the necessity that created it? John Jacob Astor built his empire through desperate effort. He arrived with nothing. He worked relentlessly. He made decisions that would haunt him morally but enrich him materially. He had no choice but to succeed because the alternative was poverty and obscurity. His children never faced such pressure. They inherited wealth that freed them from necessity. They could choose their occupations, if they chose any at all. They could pursue pleasure or principle without worrying about where the next meal would come from. Each generation grew more distant from the source of family wealth. Each generation assumed the money would always be there. Each generation spent more freely and managed less carefully. The pattern is not unique to the Astors. Sociologists who study wealthy families have identified predictable stages of decline. The first generation creates wealth through innovation and effort. The second generation maintains it through professional management. The third generation begins consuming rather than building. By the fourth or fifth generation, the fortune has typically dissipated. The Astors followed this pattern almost exactly. John Jacob I built. William preserved. John Jacob III began the display. John Jacob IV neglected the source. Vincent tried to save what remained, but concluded the effort was hopeless. Could different choices have produced different outcomes? Perhaps. If the family had invested in new industries rather than relying on real estate, if the heirs had been trained for responsibility rather than raised for society, if the feuds and divorces had not fragmented the fortune into ever smaller pieces. But such alternatives require imagining people who were not shaped by the very wealth they inherited. The American Astors were products of their privilege. They acted as their upbringing taught them to act. They failed as their circumstances allowed them to fail. The fortune that took a lifetime to build disappeared in 4 generations. The name that commanded fear and respect became a curiosity, then a footnote, then a brand licensed to hotels and real estate developments that have no connection to the family. John Jacob Astor died believing he had founded a dynasty. He was wrong. He had only founded a fortune. And fortunes, without the character that creates them, do not last. The Astors stand as warning and example. Wealth creates opportunity, but not automatically wisdom. Privilege provides comfort, but not necessarily purpose. The families that endure across centuries are those who transmit values along with assets, who train heirs for responsibility rather than entitlement. The Astors transmitted only money, and money, in the end, was not enough. Subscribe now if you enjoy these stories of old money dynasties and their fates. The history of great fortunes is often the history of great failures, and we will continue exploring both in future episodes. The Astors built an empire. Their heirs destroyed it. And somewhere, in the marble halls of mansions now demolished, the ghost of John Jacob Astor perhaps still whispers his only regret. He should have bought more land. He should have raised better children. He could do only one of those things, and he chose wrong.